Welcome back to the Faith Forward podcast. John Ackerman, Brian Bales, and we're in the fourth week of this series called Heartbeat, kind of.
Yeah.
Because if you were here on Mother's Day weekend, we had Trisha Lott Williford here doing a fantastic message on the story of Noah and rainbows. And if you missed that, you definitely want to go back into the YouTube archives or off our website and check that out.
And if you're a listener of this podcast via audio or watching it on YouTube, you know that usually the Faith Forward podcast that comes out at 2 o'clock on Sunday is an add-on, additional information about how to take your faith forward based upon the message. So typically what we say is that these podcasts, these YouTube versions can stand on their own, but it's really helped if you listen to the Sunday message.
Sure.
But if you go back and listen to the Sunday message that she did on Noah, it will really be great, but you might be a little confused when you listen to the podcast.
Yep, because I didn't have enough time to prep for her message. And so instead we decided to take this week's topic from the Gospel of Luke on the story of the father with two sons and do one episode on the younger son and one episode on the older son.
Right.
So if you missed last week's podcast episode that had nothing to do with Trisha and Noah and rainbows, it had everything to do with this Sunday's message.
Yeah.
And so if you caught it, today is going to be a helpful continuation. If you missed last week's episode, would strongly encourage you to go back and listen to it because there's some really good stuff in there. But today, as we now talk specifically on the podcast about the older son, Brian, why don't you give us a little bit of a context for this Sunday's message in general?
Right. Well, this section of Scripture in Luke chapter 15, if you have any sort of church background at all, there's a good chance you've heard it before. But even if you've not or don't have a church background, you've probably heard the term like, well, they're a prodigal son or they're a prodigal daughter. And it's a high likelihood that the person who's using that term, whether they know it or not, that term is rooted in this story, this parable that Jesus tells in Luke chapter 15. It is the third of three that he tells in there. He tells one about a lost sheep, a lost coin, and then he talks about this one. Now, one of the interesting things about this particular one that I focused on Sunday and why we thought it was important to have two basically podcasts, one on the younger son and one on the older son is that for most of us, if we've had the opportunity to engage this parable of Jesus before, if your experience is similar to mine, and I imagine it might be, the vast majority of the focus has been on the younger son. In fact, that's why some of our Bible versions, they have a title above this section. And just so you know, chapter markings in the Bible are not inspired. Someone put them in there to help us, break it up for us. The titles of things like the one that you might see above Luke 15 called the prodigal son, Jesus never called it that. And one of the challenges of this particular section of Scripture that I believe the wrong titling has created is that we tend to focus only on one son. And so recently I heard someone refer to this as the parable of the lost sons, plural, because in reality, while one was physically lost and didn't understand the heart of the father, one was physically right in the house and still didn't understand the heart of the father. And that's where I spent the most of my time talking about on this Sunday message, not because not talking about the younger son is not important, it is, but that tends to be the one that we know more about. And so I felt like I could spend a little less time and focus a little more time on the older son and the struggle of not understanding the heart of the father that really shows up in this idea is that there's this belief around grace and earning that isn't really the heartbeat of God. So this whole series has been about God's heartbeat is that everyone is redeemed and that everyone then lives from the reality of that redemption.
Yeah.
And a graphic I used on Sunday is actually a graphic that I don't know if it's original with me, but I feel like it is. But, nothing's quite original. Maybe someone else mentioned it before, that sort of stuff. That really helped me understand how I was living my Christian life for so long. And that is pre-conversion. It's all grace. Like by grace I'm saved. There's nothing I could do to earn it. Nothing I could do to be redeemed. Nothing I could do to be justified. But once I became a son, I very much fit in the mold of the older son. I actually am the eldest, but more importantly, spiritually, the mold of the older son, to where post-cross, I felt like I had to earn everything. The term that I used on Sunday was I had to justify my justification. that Jesus didn't waste his grace on me, that Jesus wasn't overtly extravagant. And so it put me in this position for many times and many years in my Christian life. And I have to be honest, it is something really easy to fall back to still, even in my life, even though I'm aware there's an issue, to where I feel like that I just have to constantly earn the grace of God. Like if something bad happens, it's because I deserve it. If something good happens, it was just, I don't know why that happened. I didn't deserve it. But certainly if I do something bad, my expectation is all kinds of bad things to happen. And is this illustration? I spiritually was the home of the Father, son of Jesus, but I didn't know his heartbeat. And that's really what the older son illustrates. And so if you find yourself to be a person, whether you've listened to Sunday or whether this is your first engagement, where you just feel like you're constantly waiting for the other shoe to drop. You're constantly feeling like, if I don't perform and do this, God is going to smite me. You know, I use the biblical, or God is going to walk away from me, or God is going to look at me poorly. Think this podcast is for you. Yeah, this is for you. So we're going to talk about how to take our faith forward and to really know the heart of God truly from that Sunday. And also, I love some of these practical tips that, John, you've put together here to help us. Many times I use the term a diagnostic tool. Like, all right, first off, how do I know if I have this problem? We're going to talk a few things. If you feel this, you probably have this problem. But then how do we allow Jesus to change our behavior? Because here's the thing. You can hear this podcast, if you don't pay attention, can think, I'm walking away with one more thing I have to do to earn being approved. That is not what we're talking about.
No, not at all. And you had mentioned, Brian, that for many people, the way that they heard this story growing up, or even in a more contemporary sense, was in an either-or context, that you're either one son or the other. And in the last episode, we referenced a book written by Henry Nouwen that he wrote based off of Rembrandt's painting of this particular story in the scriptures. And Henry Nouwen's takeaway was that we have all been the younger son. We have all been the older son. And so the invitation is for us to explore a little bit more of our spiritual reality. And this story was so disruptive when Jesus told it, as the scriptures record, because he told it in the presence of some of the Pharisees and the religious leaders and the teachers of the law. And they were completely on board with the younger son is just a screw up.
Yeah.
Right? You know, frittered away all of the, not only the responsibilities, but the resources of his family. And he came back and, well, thank goodness the father is kind and accepting. But Jesus throws him a curveball when he starts talking about the older son. Because from the outside, they're looking at the older son as the model. Yes, this is what we should do. And it's hard not to look at the way that Jesus wraps up this story as the older son is not all he's cracked up to be. And so, again, we said this last time, and we'll say it again here. Too often we focus on behavior in this story of the two sons, but it's really about sight. And we said in the last episode that in leaving the younger son, when he left the house, he was blind. He was completely blind to the love and the generosity of his father, that his father was already and had always been bestowing.
Yeah.
And then when he returned, the younger son was still blind to the love and the mercy that his father had always been offering, but he's now finally experiencing it. But here's the curveball. In staying and in working hard, the older son had been blind to both, blind to the love and generosity and the love and the mercy from his father the entire time he was home. And you said it once already. We're going to say this line a few times because it's just that good. Just because you were in the home of your father does not mean you know the heart of your father.
No. And I think there's so much about this that we could dive into. This truthfully could be a several-hour podcast that, maybe some of our devoted fans named Kathy or Brooke would listen to. And if you're not listening, that's my wife, Kathy, and John's wife, Brooke. But one of the things that, even as I was just processing this, is that Jesus is not interested in bringing cultural ethics to play in this, or cultural thing, but kingdom ethics into this conversation. And what's so interesting, I spent a little time on Sunday, and if you didn't listen, this is why I'm kind of adding this to your notes, because he's telling this story inside a very specific way of seeing life in the Eastern world, still there, called an honor-shame culture. And the beginning part of the story about kingdom ethics fit in some ways into this view of honor and shame. But then he sort of makes his twist where it says, even though this younger brother has brought shame to the family, the love of God is greater than any offense we can ever do. His love can overcome that. And the representatives of the older brother that were hearing this story were a group of religious people called the Pharisees, who first off had a problem with that, but then he turns the kingdom ethics to it and begins to shine a light onto them to understand that they themselves aren't actually bringing honor to the truth about who God is in the way that they're acting, in the way that they think. And what's really interesting as I thought about this is that many times kingdom ethics can mirror some aspects of earthly ethics. But at any point, there's a contrast between earthly ethics or cultural ethics and kingdom ethics, and we feel more drawn to the cultural or more drawn to the earthly ethics than the kingdom ethics. That is a sign that something in us doesn't understand or is unwilling to understand the heart of the Father. Because one of the things about this parable is like, you see a resolution with the younger brother. You don't see a resolution in the older brother. And I think, this is my opinion, it's not in there, it's because Jesus told this as both a theological statement, but also an invitation to those who had the older brother mentality to make a personal reflection and then make a decision about how they want to live.
Yeah. And so to that point about particularly the cultural ethic and the kingdom ethic, one of the things that drives people crazy with this particular story and this particular son is there's some things that the older son sees correctly. He's got a good read on. For example, it's right to stay at home and work hard to support the family.
Yeah.
Right? That's biblical, it's logical, it's cultural, it's kingdom. It's all of them.
All there.
As the older son, there are some things he's entitled to. Right? That's cultural, that's biblical, that's like he's right. And he's right that the younger son has been irresponsible, and more importantly, it's had an effect.
Yeah, it brought shame.
It did.
And whether we're in an honor and shame culture, the Bible says honor your father and mother. You should not, no matter what, they bring shame in that way. And so I mentioned this on Sunday, and I think we'd all agree, like if we were looking at the resumes of two people, like who are we going to hire for a job?
Yeah.
I don't know anyone, unless like you're like, maybe working for one of those mountain outfitters or whitewater rafting people sort of jobs, but you still want them to understand safety and follow rules. Everyone's attracted to the older brother.
Yeah. And
in that attraction, and I believe it is just what you said, John, of doing so many things right, we're missing that right actions, as I said on Sunday, does not always reflect a right heart.
Yeah.
And I have to say personally, this is something that I resonate with in my struggle with the older brother for so long, is that there's so many things that I would say that I did that was right, but not from the right heart. I did it in that transactional way that I talked about Sunday. So God would not be mad at me, or that would be in favor of God, that he would like me more.
Right.
And I never came out and said that, but that's really the heart behind it. And I think with the younger brother, the heart seems more obvious, so we could focus on that. With the older brother, the outside seems to look a whole lot better, but the inside, it's just the same. In fact, it just made me think of the top of my head. There's some connection to the Pharisees, because later on Jesus says something like this: the outside of you, talking to the people who acted and worked that way, it's like whitewashed tombs.
Yep.
And that wasn't an insult in the fact that they were really pretty and it looked good. But he said the problem is it's a tomb. The inside, it's dead.
Yeah.
It's full of dead man's bones. And I think that what creates for some of us who struggle with that older brother mentality, man, the outside looks really good, because there's a lot of right things that are happening.
There is. And this is one of the challenges. And so here's the first diagnostic. The older brother is really looking primarily through the lens of rules. And some of those rules are kingdom rules as well as cultural rules. But he's really focused on the rules, right? It's right to stay at home. There's things that I'm entitled to as the older son, and my little brother has seriously jacked things up.
Oh, yeah.
For me, for himself, for our father, right? The rules have been broken. And so here's one of the interesting things to pay attention to. Pay attention to your reaction when someone else gets something that they don't deserve. What's your internal reaction? And for most of us, if we're being honest, it's, I don't like it. That's not fair. And one of the things that I saw in all the years that I was teaching high schoolers was we all want to be treated the same way right up until the moment where I feel I deserve to be treated differently. Right? You mentioned before we were recording, both your wife and I both taught in the same department for a while.
Yeah.
You give a group project and you tell everybody you're going to get the same grade, and that all sounds great until somebody does more work than somebody else. But the whole project's not quite up to snuff, and so everybody gets a bad grade, and now there's a protest.
Yes, there is.
Now there's a protest because the one that did all the work feels like they deserve something different. Now the one that didn't do any of the work is like, you know what, I'm okay with what I got.
Yeah.
And so there's this interesting natural reaction that we have to what we perceive as injustice. And so again, if we're going to follow Henry Nouwen's advice that we've all got a little bit of the younger son in us, we've all got a little bit of the older son, first diagnostic is, how do you respond when somebody gets something that you feel, because if we're being honest, that's what it is. How do you respond when somebody gets something that you feel they don't deserve?
And let me dig a little bit into that, because my natural bent when Jon asked this question first is thinking through this aspect of, if I felt like Jon gets something he doesn't deserve, my natural bent was Jon got something positive he doesn't deserve. There's another side of that coin where all of a sudden, especially true in this particular story, that Jon didn't get something negative. Like when we feel like that they didn't get what they deserve, if we find ourselves, one thing saying, oh, they got something positive they didn't deserve, that's an insight. But if we look at someone and go, they got away with something they shouldn't have got away with, and it's worse if we feel like we've done the right thing and then we got in trouble. I was having this conversation with my son just recently about middle school. And middle school is not the best environment for anybody that I recall. And I'm not trying to say it's awful. I'm just saying it's hard. And we're having a conversation, and it was around, well, what if someone bullied you or hit you, right? And his take was, well, I wouldn't want to hit them back. And I said, why? He said, because I don't want to get in trouble. And I asked him, well, why would you think you would get in trouble for defending yourself? And he just said, because that's how it works, right? Like it's the second person on the basketball team who fouled, who pushes back. It's a second. That tends to happen. And I think there's many people who found themselves in that sort of scenario where they feel like I'm getting punished and I didn't do the bad thing. I was just defending myself, or I was doing good stuff. And then all of a sudden someone compromises my credit card. That happened to me recently. And this person was doing all kinds of bad stuff and nothing bad is happening to them. That's another way to think about it. Because I think if you've not experienced someone who's getting positive things that you don't think you deserve, my bet is you've experienced someone who's not getting negative things that you feel like maybe they shouldn't deserve it, but I'm getting negative things and I definitely don't deserve it. So it doesn't seem fair they're not getting the negative.
You're running late for work and you're speeding and you really hope there's no police officer. Somebody else blows by you doing 90 on the highway and you're looking every which way for a cop car with lights on because they need to get busted.
That's right. That's right.
I did something bad, but they did something worse. They did something good, but I did something better. Where's my reward? So practical tip number one is just pay attention to that internal tension because it's there. Let's just be honest. It's there. And this isn't about suppressing it. This isn't about ignoring it. It's about inviting God into a conversation of let's dig into that. Let's dig into that feeling of justice, of rightness, of righteousness. Right? It's the parable that Jesus tells of the vineyard owner that goes out in the morning and hires workers and goes out throughout the day and keeps hiring workers and gets to the end of the day and pays them all the same. Right? That will mess you up if you're willing to be honest with yourself because it just seems unfair. And so how do you do with unfair? That's a place God wants to talk to you about.
Yep.
So there's some things that God wants to talk to you about because there's some things that we don't see clearly. And in many cases, it's the same thing that the older son didn't see clearly. There were some things that he was seeing rightly. There were rules that were being broken, but he was looking entirely through the lens of rules. And there were some things, just like we talked about with the younger son, the older son was blind as well. And he was blind in some pretty key areas. One of them being he doesn't see himself clearly. Right? He self-identifies when his father comes out to him after his younger brother's returned and the party has started, and the older brother is indignant and refuses to go in and join the celebration. His father comes out, and the older brother, the older son, self-identifies as a slave. Right? This is who I am. This is what I've been doing for you. Right? He doesn't see himself clearly. And he also is blind to why his father loves him. Because in that self-profession of who he thinks he is, he's also identifying why he thinks his father loves him.
Yeah.
Which is what he does, what he provides, what he produces, his work, his effort, his behavior, and not simply because of who he is. That his father loves him because that's his kid. And he's also very, very blind to what his father desires of him. Because again, through his own self-profession, you can tell that he's convinced that what his father really wants is his work.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what he's blind to, even as the father models this by coming out to him, which again, culturally, just like no father would have gone running to the younger son, no father would have left the ceremony to go beg and plead for the older son to come in, which was the older son's responsibility as the oldest, is to come in and be sort of like host of the feast.
You're pointing out something that I think that could be easily missed if we're not careful. And so I want to camp just for a second.
Yeah.
Is that there was a worldview that the older brother had that the younger brother didn't fit in. And so when the younger brother, with his wrong worldview, did all the things that he did, the older brother was very judgmental, right? How dare you not bring honor to our family? How dare you bring shame? Now, when then the father did something that also, which was correct, but didn't fit in the older brother's worldview, we could easily miss this. He felt justified in then not giving honor to his father and shaming him. Because just as you mentioned, not showing up to the party is an act of shame. It is not giving honor where it's due. The way that this parable is told by Jesus, and in the way that the son, the eldest son, would have spoken to the father, in and of itself, when we understand maybe the Old Testament law in Leviticus, that could have got him in some serious trouble. So we could read this and miss the fact that he is basically doing the same thing that the younger brother is. It's just different in how it's the same illness, different symptom.
Right.
But he feels justified, which is a reminder for me. What happens in those moments in my life? What happens in your moments in life when we feel justified to do things we know that are not justified? Yeah. He felt justified to judge his brother, and he felt justified to judge his father, which, by the way, in this story clearly represents God. Because the way the brother did something didn't fit in his worldview, but even more so, the way his father did something didn't fit. And I think for a lot of us, we have these moments where we may not come out and say your son or refuse to do them as actively, but internally, our heart often wants to justify our earthly ethics, our earthly ways of doing things, because the kingdom ethic of the father doesn't match. And we don't recognize that basically we're having the same problem as the younger son.
Yeah. And so we asked a question in last week's episode, and we're going to ask it again because we talked about how this is a pivotal question for both sons. That even though outwardly the circumstances look entirely different, inwardly it's almost the exact same heart condition. And the question was simply this: in recognition of the fact that you don't have to wait to have the younger son experience of waking up in the pig pen, nor do you have to wait to have the moment of outrage and indignation of the older son. We can begin to dig into some of this now. And so as we often do, we pause here to say the requisite statement: ask God, and specifically ask him this question: God, would you help me to see myself more clearly? Would you help me to see myself more clearly in the ways that I am the younger son and in the ways that I am the older son? Because what we discovered last week, and we reiterate here, is that both sons are essentially asking the same question: Father, will you give me what I want without having the relationship? Where am I insisting on God's blessing without the relationship? It's a really disruptive question to sit with for more than 5 seconds.
And I think the tension is, and John, I want you to expand on this, that this belief that too often we think that God's heartbeat can be learned intellectually, but yet it needs to be experienced. Expand on that if you would.
Yeah, that's an interesting one because, one, I love learning and I love knowing things. And so there's a temptation even in the relationship with God that as long as I know stuff, I'm good. But, we saw with the younger son, when he returns home, he's fairly convinced that he knows stuff. He's fairly convinced that he knows how his father's going to receive him.
Sure.
Begrudgingly at best.
Which is really funny. I want to stop there that you said that he left because he was fairly convinced he knew stuff.
Yep.
And he didn't understand the heart of God.
Yep.
And he came back while humbled, still with the I'm fairly convinced this is how it works idea.
Yep. And so this is the ultimate problem, right? As long as we're trying to approach God intellectually as Father, we're going to miss stuff. And so you really can only come to know the Father experientially. And that's what the younger son discovers when he returns home, is that everything he thought he knew about his father when he left was wrong. And everything he thought he knew about his father when he returned was wrong, because he experienced the Father when he returned. And that was an experience, as we talked about last episode, that he was then invited into the next day and the next day, as he was probably waiting to see if there was going to be another shoe that would drop. If the facade of the loving Father would ever disappear and the angry, harsh, disciplinarian, punitive Father showed up that he secretly feared was there the whole time, right? He had to experience his Father. And so does the older son. The older son is fairly convinced that he knows who his father is, or at least he thought he knew.
Yeah.
And now he thinks he knows differently, right? I thought I knew that Dad is tough but fair, that Dad is all about the rules, and that if I do what I'm supposed to do, there are rewards. And if I don't do what I'm supposed to do, there are consequences.
That's correct.
And like you said, he just saw his entire worldview get thrown out the window when he saw his father run to embrace his brother.
And again, this is a parable. So it means that Jesus created an earthly story to make a heavenly point. But I don't think we can miss something that you just said. Rarely do I run into someone, unless they're super young, that at some point hasn't had their whole worldview challenged. And that is an opportunity to understand the truth about God. I mean, how would I say it this way? The question of why do bad things happen to good people is a question of my worldview is challenged.
Yes.
In this time, why do good things happen to bad people?
Yep.
That's a worldview challenge. And so you don't have to take yourself back 2,000 years and pretend that there's this moment where there's a son that ran away and came back and it's a son that stayed and was bitter. We can go back in our own moments. And maybe some people right now have yet to really grasp the heart of God because their whole worldview has been challenged so badly that they don't know what to do with it. And especially in this older son, and I'm going a little off topic here, but for me, I just felt like I should share this, that I'm confident that there's somebody listening to this, whether it's the Sunday after we just did this talk or whether it's 5 years in the future. I don't know. It's on the internet, doesn't die.
Yeah.
Remember that, kids, when you're posting stuff, by the way. That's just a side note. There's somebody here, though, who's listening that still views the God of the big stick. And so enough of their whole worldview has been challenged that they don't love God, but they fear him enough to not do anything wrong.
Yeah.
And so there was a prayer that I prayed one time. And I think sometimes I'm there, sometimes I'm not. But this was it. God, let me love you more than I fear you. And for me, that meant this. I want to do the things that I'm doing based upon the relational connection and love that I have for my Father, who loves me more than I can ask or imagine. But too often, I was motivated by he's only going to show up when I screw up. And I'm afraid of that, and I'm afraid of the things that come, and so I don't want to mess up. It's the same idea of like, I'm going to get caught, and I'm going to get in trouble when I return fire, or whatever it might be. And so if you're listening to this, it strikes me that you could even be listening to this because you are a duty-bound, fear-based son of God.
Yeah.
Duty-bound, fear-based daughter of the Almighty God. The heartbeat of God for you is not to live out of fear.
No. I mean, it really sheds new light on when Jesus said, if you love me, you'll obey my commandments.
Yes. Not if you fear me, you'll obey my commandments.
Right. Mm-hmm. And too often we've conflated loving him with fearing him. And there is a very right place to fear God. It's the beginning of wisdom.
Yeah.
But that's not the primary motivator for the relationship. And I mean, this was just last week that God was talking to me a little bit about this, because what happens when you prepare notes for Sunday messages or Wednesday podcasts is God talks to you about your stuff. And so again, this was last week. This was the day after airing last week's episode on the younger son that God and I were having a little moment. And he was reminding me that the relationship is what matters the most to him, not the work. That it's the closeness that he desires, not the output. That if he has the closeness, the work is guaranteed. And more importantly, then the work is good. And whenever God uses that word good, he means it in a very particular way. But without the closeness, the work is filthy rags. And he was reminding me, you can do nothing for me and everything from me. And so which will you choose? And that was the invitation being extended even in this moment to the older son as he's standing outside the party and the father, breaking with tradition, comes out to him. It's an invitation again, son, I don't need you to do anything for me. Everything that I have has always been yours.
Yeah, there's such a pattern in this that for us goes against its kingdom ethics and blows up our worldview. The one person who is consistently treated poorly in this story is the father. Yet he is the one person that consistently initiates the relationship. And, that's not how it worked in that culture. And by the way, that's not how it works in our culture either. We're not honor shame. We're more law and order. But, the truth is we expect the person who is the offender to come back.
Yeah.
And initiate the I'm sorry, try to fix the relationship, try to pursue the relationship. Rarely. Right? And in fact, if we think about it, there are times that we would even use language like, well, that's an abusive relationship if the person who's constantly being offended is the one trying to fix the relationship. But that's not how it works with God, even though, truthfully, we treat him in ways we should never treat him. But because of the all-knowing, all-powerful, all-loving God of the universe, he is constantly pursuing us to help us understand at deeper levels the impact and the reality of the redemption that he's given us and what it means. And we started this series with this idea that when we are justified, when we're redeemed, he sees us like he sees Jesus, that no matter what, doesn't mean he likes the bad things. He still loves us. We still belong to him, and we're still accepted. And that's what this illustrates. He's still initiating. And that makes me uncomfortable. Because truthfully, it makes me uncomfortable because it goes against my worldview. Even though in my head, I know that's not the true worldview. Right? But there is an expectation. You did the wrong offense. You come back to me when you're ready to fix it. Not, okay, let me pursue you to pursue this relationship. Because it feels like, for me sometimes, I'm saying that what happened is okay. And I also don't want you to hear this about the story. There's nothing in this story that the father is saying to the older son or to the younger son that what you did is okay. What he is showing is there's no offense greater than the grace and the love of God.
And I love how frequently you just use the word initiate. That's what God does, is he initiates this. He doesn't wait for us to get it right and come to him. He doesn't wait for us to realize on our own the depth of our stupidity or rebelliousness or arrogance or pride or whatever. He initiates. And I found that word fascinating this week because that word popped up for me based off something that God and I were talking about 4 years ago, which is at least how long this has been a topic / my whole life. But there is a need for us on a regular basis, not only to have God initiate things with us, but if I can use the word this way, to initiate us. And so I wanted to share just a little bit of what that conversation from 4 years ago looked like and how it's still playing out. Because you, at the end of the service on Sunday, talking about some challenging prayers, you were inviting us to ask God to help us create a disposition that we don't have to earn in order to be loved. And asking God to help us create a practice of trust. And so it brings us back again to this idea that this relationship with God cannot be primarily intellectual, it has to be experienced.
No, you mentioned that, and I'll just be fully honest. I don't like that last question. I don't like, it's the only way to experience, because I know if I'm asking God to help me create a practice of trust, there's going to be moments of things that test it.
Yeah.
It's kind of like why I don't pray for the P word, patience, right? It's the same thing.
It is.
But it's the only way to grow.
It is. And those things have to be experienced, right? A practice of trust has to be experienced.
Yes.
A disposition of knowing that you're loved without earning has to be experienced, right? That younger son waking up the next day and the next day and the next day and discovering his father still loves him, even though he hasn't recouped the family losses, right? And so that's this idea of initiation, because that word at its core is really talking about an introduction to an ongoing experience and practice of discovering a particular way of life that prior to that moment you were unfamiliar with. And just like so many other words throughout history have gotten hijacked, that word initiation has gotten hijacked. And I have serious issues with all the wrong ways that word initiation has been used to talk about unnecessary pain or unnecessary shame or just unnecessary jumping through hoops in order to get to something that you want.
Yeah.
But what the Father's modeling here is inviting both of his sons into a time of training and development to prepare them for a life to come. Right? At some point, they will no longer be young. They will be, and again, it comes back to the Henry Nouwen book, everyone has been the younger son, everyone has been the older son, and everyone is being invited to become the father. And that's what the Father in this story has been trying to initiate his sons into, is what it looks like to be a father. This is how you treat your children when you have them. This is how you treat your resources when you have them. This is how you treat your kingdom when the kingdom comes to you. And neither son was able to handle it at first. Right? The younger son thought life in his father's kingdom was too hard. And so he just left. Right? I don't like these rules. I'm out. And I'm taking stuff with me.
Yeah. And the older son thought life in the kingdom was only hard.
Yeah.
And for me, that's why I just keep going back like, man, I just relate so much. I can't believe, I'm not sure if I've said this on the podcast before. I know I've said it in front of you, probably said it somewhere. My wife looked at me one point and said, Brian, you don't know how to have fun. You don't know how to have joy. And I made some snide comment and then said, well, it's just because I have fun or joy differently than you. It's not true. It wasn't true at all. I didn't have fun. That mine was not fun or joy, and it partially was this older brother mentality that the way of the kingdom is hard, always hard. There are hard. Hear me. There are hard things in the kingdom. To quote my good friend Jon, I may misquote it, but because it's hard, it makes it worth it many times. Is that close? Am I getting close with that?
It's the hard that makes it good.
The hard that makes it good. See, there you go. I knew it was a little bit different than that. So it's not hard that's wrong, but it's the only hard. It's the only hard, that this is a drudgery. This is I just have to get through this to get to what's next.
Yeah.
And it's missing that John 10, that when Jesus said he came to have life and life to the full, that was both a future statement and a present statement.
Yeah.
And the way the older brother rather, viewed life was that there was a payoff sometime in the future that grace didn't apply in the current life. And so it was the earning and it was all hard.
Yep. And
the younger brother, in many ways, are like, man, that seems like a bad beat, man.
Yep.
Let's go have some fun now. There's no guarantee of this. There's no guarantee of that. And in many ways, I think that now again, I've taken this a little off topic, and I do that often on this podcast, but I just think that for us, here's a diagnostic. If you think of the Christian life almost exclusively through the lens of this is hard and only going to be hard, and you find yourself enjoying the fact that everything about it is hard, and that's the only true joy you're getting, and in the back of your mind, you know what you're thinking? Someday there's going to be a great payoff. You're missing something.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah, it's easy to look at the younger son and everything that he threw away to pursue, joy and delight in all the materialistic ways now, but it's just as heartbreaking to see the son in his father's house completely missing out on all the joy in favor of a anticipated down the road, maybe it gets better.
Yeah.
You're right. And so there has to be a third option. Right? There has to be a third. Neither one of these is the good option. And so Jesus never tells a story without a way out. And so there has to be a third option, because there is a reality that your father is asking you to do work. You will have trouble in this life.
Yes.
Right? Guaranteed. But his invitation to do work and to do the hard things in life is with him, not for him. That's the third way. Your father's asking you to do work, but it's invitation with him. It's not drudgery and it's not punishment. Your father is dead set on maturing you, but it's loving and it's kind. And it's for your good, and not in the punitive way that phrase has been used. Well, this is for your own good. This is legitimately the best possible thing. And again, there are pieces of our life that seem to absolutely defy the truth of that statement. There is no way that was for my good. There is no way that could have been for my good. And so we're not trying to distort. We're not trying to conflate. But when we're talking about God maturing us, when we're talking about stepping into hard things with God, it's loving and kind maturation. That's his heart. That's his goal. It's not throwing his children to the wolves or throwing them in the deep end of the pool and waiting to see who sinks and who swims. And so it begs a third question for you and God to consider. Where did you experience a lack of initiation? Or where did you experience unhealthy initiation? Where did you experience a lack of fathering or mothering or coaching? Or where did you experience unhealthy fathering or mothering or coaching? Because it's in those places that we were supposed to experience this aspect of the Father, that there are hard things coming.
Yep.
But I'm going to do it with you. I'm going to invite you into the hard things I'm doing. And I'm going to show you how to grow in this space. And I'm going to show you that there are hard things that are actually good and worth doing. And so what did the absence of that teach you? If you didn't get that good fathering, mothering, coaching, initiation, what did it teach you about God? What did it teach you about yourself? What did it teach you about work? And like we mentioned before, in many cases, that word initiation has been used poorly. It's been used to mean unnecessary or pointless suffering or shame. And you're right to rebel against that. But good initiation does require something. It requires sacrifice. It requires sacrifice in the sense that it requires setting aside old things to willingly enter into new and better. Good initiation from the Father, does require a level of stripping away, particularly the stripping away of untrue things about you. The things the younger son believed about himself, the things the older son believed about himself and about his father. And true initiation, fatherly initiation, requires a level of challenge, right? So that you know that you've been prepared for what lies ahead. That younger son now has an experiential knowledge of who his father is and what his father can endure and what he can endure as he grows into his father's image. And there's something really cool about this that just struck me, that even Jesus, when it comes to his Father blessed him in the river when Jesus got baptized. He comes up out of the water, the Spirit descends, God the Father speaks audibly for all to hear, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased." Jesus got blessed in the river. He got initiated in the wilderness, right? Where his Father led him, where the Spirit of God led him into something hard. And in the wilderness, he willingly and willfully sacrificed. He fasted for 40 days. He submitted to being stripped away, right? 40 days of lack, of deprivation, of discovering what he's capable of enduring. And then, oh, by the way, at the end of that, the most evil being in the world shows up to challenge him at the core of who he is.
Yeah.
Right? God said, "You're his son, prove it. If you're his son, turn these stones into bread. Do some things out of your own power. In fact, how about I give you more power? Just bow down and worship me." Right? That's not a walk in the park for Jesus. That's at the end of 40 days of sacrifice and being stripped away. Right? And there were some pretty significant consequences riding on whether or not that worked. We talked in the last episode about Jesus being the second Adam. Jesus could have very well been the second Adam if he were anyone but who he was.
Yep.
Could have once again handed over the keys to the kingdom to Satan. And so it also brings us to this. That wasn't a moment. That was 40 days of a moment coming after 30 years of life that then preceded 3 more years of work. Right? Initiation cannot be a single day. This moment of experiencing the Father cannot be that. It cannot be a moment. It's a series of moments. It's a lifetime of moments. You have to endure this so that you know who your Father is and who you are and what you're capable of. And it has to be real. There has to be opportunity for failure and success. That younger son, right, there were consequences to him walking away. One of the things I learned relatively recently was that when he asked for that third of his inheritance, that means his father has to sell off lands that have been in the family for generations. That's land that doesn't come back because the land stays in families. And so whoever the father sold that land to get the money to give to his son is now in the hands of that family for generations to come. Right? It's not like he just borrowed $20 from his dad.
Yeah. It's not that there aren't results of poor decisions that we make.
Yeah.
But there's also, even those poor decisions with the difficult results, God's grace.
Yeah.
I think all of us can think of times where we've played the role of the younger son.
Yeah.
And we can even look in our own lives right now and think, oh, that X or that Y is a result of playing the role of the younger son. Yep. And it's still there. But God's grace is still sufficient in the moment. It doesn't define you. And see, that's the thing. Yep. The younger brother, and I know we're talking about the older brother, the younger brother wanted to let his younger brotherness define him.
Yep.
And that was not what defined him. Yep. It was his position. So even if there are results and consequences this side of eternity, it's not who we are. It doesn't define us.
Not at all. But it is those consequences, right, that allows the younger brother to realize who he is and who his father is when he returns, because he knows that what happened when he left mattered. Mm-hmm. It had an effect. And in the face of those effects, in the face of those consequences, he's still experiencing the reality of who his father truly is. And it's that's preparing him to become like his father in his own right. He has been stripped away. He has been challenged. He has failed without becoming a failure. And he sacrificed his pride and his selfishness and his greed.
Yeah.
Sacrificed them on the altar and watched them burn. But the older son wasn't ready for that yet. He wasn't yet submitted to having things stripped away. He hadn't learned to rightly recognize the challenges in his life. And I love this phrase. He was fighting what he should have loved, his father, and he was loving what he should have fought against, which was his selfishness. Mm-hmm. He has not become willing to sacrifice old things, right? Because that's where Jesus leaves the story. The son's still outside. He's not yet been willing to hand over the anger and the unforgiveness and the greed. He's not yet been ready to receive the things his father is offering him, the rightful things in the kingdom. And so again, as always, the invitation here is to now go spend some time with God. Yep. To not just treat this intellectually or academically, but to take whatever things jumped out and to go ask God about you and him and kingdom rules and kingdom ethics.
That's right.
How he sees things and what he's inviting you into next.
Good word, my friend.
So as always, thank you for being a part of this journey. Thank you for being a part of our journey, because we are still very much in process.
And sometimes in front of the camera.
That's
and on
right.
podcast, processing with you.
Yep. So until next time, friends, we'll see you.